Okay, so what I have here is a 2006 Suzuki Ozark. Now, the problem I'm having with this is the front wheel bearings are worn out. Now, on this one, it actually has some play. I don't know if you can see that, but there's play in the wheel bearing and it allows the wheel to wobble back and forth. So I got a new set of wheel bearings and seals and we're going to put those in. Now with the wheel off, the first thing you want to do is go ahead and remove the caliper. There's two bolts that hold the caliper on. Now just slide the caliper off. Now I'm going to just hang it with this piece of wire so we don't put stress on the brake line. Now with the caliper off, if I rotate the wheel bearing, you can hear how rough it is. Now I'm going to remove the cotter pin. I find that wire cutters work best for this. Now I'll remove the spindle nut. Now I'll just pull the hub off. Now if it doesn't come off easily, you can hit these bolt heads from the back to help get it off. Just make sure you don't hit the rotor. Okay, now that the hub is off, I'm going to just pull this little spacer out. Now this is what the seal actually rides on. Now this is the back one, and on the front there's another one. I'm going to set it flat on a flat surface. I'm going to take a little drift. Now there's a spacer in between the two bearings, so you want to misalign the spacer with the drift so that it sits on the bottom bearing. Now I'm just going to tap it a few times on one side, then alternate to the other side and continue tapping until it comes out. Okay, and there's the inner seal and the bearing. And there's that spacer I was talking about. Now, what I'm going to do, before I tap out the other bearing, I'm going to take the lug nuts, I'm going to thread them back onto the end, and just thread them down till they're just above the end of the stud. Now I'll take my drift and pound out the other bearing. And there's the outer bearing and seal. Now before I put the new bearings in, I'm going to just take this die grinder with a wire wheel and just clean up the inside where the bearing rides so that they go in easier. Okay, I've cleaned up the hub to put the new bearing in. Now here is the new bearing, and you notice it has rubber seals on both sides. Now the old bearing only has a rubber seal on one side. Now these particular hubs are not greasable, so there's no way to get more grease into this bearing. So this new style with two rubber seals is actually going to be better for this type of environment. All I'm going to do is just set it down in there as straight as possible. And I'm going to take a socket that matches the outside diameter of the outer race. You want to make sure that it matches the outer race and not the inner race or the dust cover. Now I'm just going to tap it into place. You can tell when it's seated by the difference in the sound. Now I'm going to flip it over. Now I'll set my spacer into the hub and set my inner bearing into place. Now I've actually got put a light coat of grease on these bearings to make them easier to install. So to set that into place, take my socket and just drive it in. Okay, now we got both bearings in, so now we can put the seals in. Okay, now something worth noting is that there's two different size seals for the inner and outer wheel bearings. The smaller seal goes on the outer bearing and the larger seal goes on the inner bearing. I'm going to take my seal and I'm just going to set it into place, and I'm just going to drive it in with the socket just like I did with the bearings. Now for the seal you don't need any kind of grease or anything. It goes in a lot easier. Now you want to be careful not to damage the seal. I'll flip it over and I'll put in my larger inner seal. Okay, now I've cleaned up everything. I'm just going to put some grease into the lip of the seal. Now I'll put my spacer in. This spacer is for the inner wheel bearing seal. I'll flip it over and do the other side. And just press the seal into place. And now we're ready to put it back on the spindle. Okay, now the spindle's all clean. I'm just going to slide my hub on. Now it might not want to go on at first because of the spacer in the middle not being aligned, so you might have to wiggle it around a bit. Wipe off the threads a little bit and put the washer and the castle nut on. I'm going to put in a new cotter pin. And trim the ends a little bit. Now if you spin it, with the new bearings on, it doesn't make all that noise anymore. It no longer has any play in it. Now I'll take my brake caliper and slide it back over the rotor. And bolt it back on. Okay, so the wheel is back on and there's no more play on it. It's nice and tight like it should be. I am missing the dust cover for the outer bearing here, which may have potentially contributed to the bearings wearing out in the first place. So I'll have to get another one of those. But the bearings should be good for a long time now.